Okay, next up, geography. As our other big explanation that is out there, may have heard of it from geographers. Most prominent is Jared Diamond, who we'll get to in a second. But really, this one, we see it way back in the 18th century, the 1700s, from Montesquieu, who kind of makes these colonial era, seemingly antiquated observations, kind of value judgments about people in the warmer climates, kind of coming up with explanations that wouldn't pass muster today about what is going on in those areas. So it's an observation that people have had for a long time, that what there does seem to be geographical differences in economic growth, that your areas further away from the equator, this is the what Montesquieu is observing, tend to be richer. So even way back then, there's people thinking maybe geography has something to do with why we see these differences, or maybe geography can help promote growth in some way. Here's just the raw correlation between latitude. So this is the further away you go from the equator, there does seem to be a relationship between latitude and the level of economic development. Okay, although obviously there are some exceptions. Here we have Singapore over here, most notable. All right, now the most prominent geographical explanation for growth comes from Jared Diamond in this seminal book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is super popular. I would imagine it's still assigned, probably taught in high schools now, if I had to guess. Okay, and now he's not really talking about the Industrial Revolution. What he's trying to explain is kind of just differences in growth that he observes. And essentially his argument, he's saying we can all trace it back to geography. And what he's saying is like, look, Europe, the reason that Europe becomes so wealthy is they have better domesticatable animals, they have better crops. This allows them to develop agricultural civilization, like a concentration of people, density. This population density facilitates germs transmission, so they get a ton of germs. Then when they move to the New World, they bring the germs with them, and it allows them to subjugate the natives because germs spread, killing 90%, although that number keeps being revised upward, 90 to 95% of the native population was killed by germs. That's basically his argument. Just to go into it in a little in depth, basically there are, according to him, about 14 possible animals that can be domesticated, large mammals that you want to domesticate that help with agriculture. Okay, and so you know what these look like. They're like oxes, and, horses, sheep, these sort of things. And it turns out there's not that many. Okay, the argument he makes is like, you could domesticate a horse, you can't domesticate a zebra. All right. And so it turns out basically Eurasia has 13 or 14 of these possible animals. So they get all the good domesticatable animals. The Americas, those only two, the llama and the alpaca. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, there is zero. There's none of these animals. Makes a similar argument with crops, saying like, look, there's actually not that many crops that can be domesticated and used for food. It's a little more difficult with this one because there's way more plants than there are animals. But he's essentially saying like, look, there's two plants that account for 41% of the calories even today in the world, wheat and rice. These two are native of Eurasia. And there's these other cereal crops that are also more prevalent in Eurasia. And really, corn is the only other like big staple crop that exists outside of Eurasia. And again, he's saying these things are actually hard to domesticate. Then, so his argument is like, basically all the good crops and animals are here because climate is similar along lines of latitude. You can spread these crops and animals across Eurasia. If I discover something down here in South America, it's hard to spread it because the climate changes. So the orientation of Eurasia helps with the transmission of these good crops and animals, where it's harder for innovations like this to spread in Africa and the Americas. So Europe and Asia, actually, China has this advantage in agricultural society. They got better crops, they got better animals, and innovations over here can spread over here. That is essentially his argument. There are tons of problems with his argument that I'm not going to go into, um, but if you're interested, you can drop by and ask me. Okay, and so Europeans develop immunity to lots of these terrible diseases because they're highly exposed to them because they live in cities. There are also other reasons for that beyond geography. There's lots of warfare in Europe, and so the cities are actually really dense because it's easier to defend a dense city. And because of that warfare, the soldiers are marching all around, spreading the germs. So that's another reason why the germs spread. Okay. All right. And so one of the problems for our class with Diamond's argument is it really only explains differences up to 1500, or maybe 1700. It really can only explain differences up to about 1700. All right. In terms of, okay, so Europe had these better crops, allows them to develop agriculture. When they come to the New World, they bring their germs with them, and it allows them to set up colonies. Well, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, which is really where the growth happens. Really, most of the growth is post 1700. Actually, almost all the growth is post 1700. It starts in England, which didn't really have great colonies, at least at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. It had actually terrible colonies in terms of producing wealth. So this explanation really just accounts for differences between countries at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. It's tough to carry this forward. Also, it doesn't really account for the differences between Europe and China. Why didn't China become so fabulously wealthy, or around the 1800s? It has similar advantages. That's a whole other question that we'll deal with later in the course. So Eric Jones is another scholar who kind of points to the difference post 1500 with Europe is that it has lots of natural borders in terms of mountains. Because of this, there was lots of warfare. That warfare engendered a culture of competition. So better political organizations, better military, better warfare inventions. And so that kind of helps bring us up to maybe 1800. Again, doesn't really explain anything post 1800. The explanation, you want to carry this explanation forward, you would say it's the presence of coal, that resource, that geographic advantage that England has, is that there's lots of coal there. Again, there's problems with that argument that we will deal with in the Industrial Revolution lecture. Okay, so the pros of the geography argument. Okay, we do see this. It seems plausible. It seems plausible that we got these animals, these crops, leads to a higher level of agricultural civilization in Eurasia. Another reason people really like this argument is that it kind of removes the hot button issues of like culture and religion from the table. So it's just like, hey, we won the geographic lottery. We just because you would have put any group of people, any culture in this area, they would have done great. Is all geography. So it's very it's an argument that people are very receptive to because it sidesteps any of these hot button issues that can get people in trouble. Now the cons of it, I'd say, is it's very backward looking in terms of like, especially with the mountain argument from Jones, where it's like, hey, Europe, did really well on the colonial stage because of these mountains, caused all this warfare. China didn't have mountains. It was like politically unified. You could easily imagine a world where China has the Industrial Revolution, comes to be the economic powerhouse of the 1900s instead of the present. And we would say, oh, it's because they were politically unified, because they didn't have these geographic barriers. That political unification was really important. So that one's a little hard to square, or it's hard to, you could come up with a story that would fit with China very easily had China developed and not England. And again, all the difficulty with this is we really only have an observation of one. So we only have an n, and in statistical terms, we have an n of one. that it's like we only get to observe this thing one time. We only get to observe history one time. It could be the case that if you played out, human history 100 times or something, 90 of those times China has the Industrial Revolution, and we just happen to be living in, the 5 times where it's England or something like that. 5 other times it's the Mayans or whatever that has the Industrial Revolution and really undergoes this economic growth first. So just in general, this is hard because of the small sample size, and so it's hard to disentangle these things. And also, ultimately, when we get to the end of this lecture, we got culture, geography, and institutions as our kind of big umbrellas of explanations. It's not going to be the case that it's just one. Obviously, it's probably most likely a combination of all three. Okay, so the cons, backward looking, and then this is really hard to test. When you look at culture, you can there are ways you can actually test the cultural argument. It's difficult, but there are ways you could test it. Similar with institutions. Geography is more difficult because it's hard to randomly assign geography. Okay,